There are moments in life when a quiet voice urges caution, yet we silence it out of duty, out of kindness, or out of fear of being selfish. But what if that voice is not mere hesitation, but the whisper of God Himself? What if the burden you carry, the endless giving, the unnoticed sacrifices, the constant exhaustion, is not a test of endurance but a sign that you have misplaced your offering? To give is noble, but to give without wisdom is folly. In His mercy, even Christ did not entrust Himself to all men, for He knew what was in their hearts. So why then do you persist in offering your light to those who mock it? This is not cruelty but wisdom. It is time to awaken, to recognize that your kindness is not meant to be squandered, but to be given where it can bear fruit. For the path of the chosen is not depletion but purpose, overcoming ridicule and rising above doubt. The night was thick with silence. The stars shimmered above like a council of watchful eyes, their cold glow casting a quiet judgment upon the earth. In the heart of a small village, a man stood alone. His words had stirred the people, yet not in the way he had hoped. They whispered behind closed doors, their voices laced with suspicion. They watched him from the shadows, their gazes heavy with doubt. He had spoken truth, and for that he was despised. He had not sought their approval, nor had he wished for their praise. Yet he had hoped that they would listen, hoped that they would see. But now he saw their backs turned against him, their hearts sealed like stone. This, he realized, was the great test. It had been the same for the prophets before him. Noah had built the ark under the mockery of his neighbors, their laughter ringing in his ears as he obeyed the voice of God. Moses had stood before Pharaoh, unwavering though the ruler's heart grew harder with every demand. Elijah had called down fire from heaven, only to find himself hunted like a criminal. Even the Messiah himself had walked this path, beloved one moment, condemned the next. Why should it be any different now? The struggles, mockery, hatred, and disbelief were preparation for this divine transformation. The world does not welcome the chosen ones. Their presence is an affront, a reminder that truth is not subject to popular opinion. Their steadfastness is a challenge, exposing the frailty of human compromise. To belong to God is to be a stranger in one's own land, to walk a road where every step invites scorn. A voice called out in the dark, breaking his thoughts. Why do you persist? Why speak when they do not listen? He turned to face the speaker. It was a young man, his eyes sharp with curiosity, yet dimmed with hesitation. There was fear in his voice, fear of the answer, fear of what it might demand. He smiled, not in derision but in understanding, because the truth remains, even when ignored, and God's calling does not fade with the world's rejection. The young man frowned. But does it not weary you, to be mocked, to be cast aside? Of course, he admitted. Even Christ wept. Even he asked why he was forsaken. But seeking the approval of men is a snare. Their praise is fleeting, their acceptance fickle. To seek their favor is to be blown like chaff in the wind. But to trust in God? That is to stand upon the rock. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like a murmuring crowd. The young man looked away, lost in thought. Then what is victory? If not their approval, victory is transformation. Those who doubted or ridiculed will soon witness God's undeniable power at work. What was once weakness will be replaced with unshakable strength. The change will be instantaneous and undeniable, shifting perception. Victory is to remain faithful, to trust when all else wavers, to endure even when abandoned. It is not measured in applause nor in the absence of trial, but in the unwavering grip upon God's truth. The young man exhaled a slow, weary breath. Yet there was something new in his eyes, something kindled. Then I will stand, he said at last. Even if they turn away, even if they laugh. A smile broke upon the older man's face, not of triumph but of joy. Then you have passed the test. And with that they turned towards the rising dawn, walking the road that so few dared to take. The burden of the well. Elias had always been a man of compassion. From a young age he had felt the pull to help those in need, to pour out his heart, time, and strength without question. It was, after all, what the Lord commanded. Love thy neighbor as thyself. But in recent days, something within him had begun to shift. At dusk, he sat by the village well, watching the golden light dance upon the water's surface. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from exhaustion. He had spent the day ministering to the poor, comforting the grieving, and counseling the weary. Yet instead of fulfillment, he felt drained, as though a great weight pressed upon his soul. An old woman approached, her eyes heavy with sorrow. "Elias," she whispered, "my son has fallen into debt. Can you spare something to help?" Elias reached for the pouch at his belt but hesitated. A quiet voice stirred within him, a whisper, like wind through the trees. Not this time. He had always given without question, but now doubt crept in. He recalled something his mother had once said. Not all who cry for help seek to stand. Some seek to lean. That night he sought the counsel of Abiel, an elder of great wisdom. "I do not understand," Elias confessed. "God calls us to give, yet my spirit is weary. Have I failed in my purpose?" Abiel smiled gently. "Elias, do you know why the well gives life?" Elias frowned. "Because it holds water." "Indeed. And what happens when the well is emptied faster than it is filled?" Elias's heart tightened. He knew the answer. "It runs dry." Abiel nodded. God does not ask you to pour yourself out until you have nothing left. Even Christ withdrew to the mountains to pray. Even he chose carefully whom he healed. "But if I turn someone away, am I not failing to love?" Elias asked. Abiel placed a hand on his shoulder. Love is not always giving what is asked, but giving what is needed. A starving man does not always need bread. Sometimes he needs to learn to plant. Elias left the elder's house with a new burden, not of weariness, but of wisdom. The next day the old woman returned. Elias met her gaze with kindness. "I will not give you money," he said, "but I will teach your son how to work the land so that he may stand on his own." Tears filled her eyes, and she bowed her head. "Thank you." Elias felt the weight lift from his heart. He understood now. Not all help was meant to be given, and discernment was as much a gift as charity. The well could only give life if it remained full, and so too must the heart. And as the sun set over the village, Elias knew he was finally walking in the wisdom of the Lord, overcoming ridicule and rising above doubt. The night was thick with silence. The stars shimmered above like a council of watchful eyes, their cold glow casting a quiet judgment upon the earth. In the heart of a small village, a man stood alone. His words had stirred the people, yet not in the way he had hoped. They whispered behind closed doors, their voices laced with suspicion. They watched him from the shadows, their gazes heavy with doubt. He had spoken truth, and for that he was despised. He had not sought their approval or wished for their praise. Yet he had hoped that they would listen, hoped that they would see. But now he saw their backs turned against him, their hearts sealed like stone. This, he realized, was the great test. It had been the same for the prophets before him. Noah had built the ark under the mockery of his neighbors, their laughter ringing in his ears as he obeyed the voice of God. Moses had stood before Pharaoh unwavering, though the ruler's heart grew harder with every demand. Elijah had called down fire from heaven, only to find himself hunted like a criminal. Even the Messiah himself had walked this path, beloved one moment, condemned the next. Why should it be any different now? The struggles, mockery, hatred, and disbelief were preparation for this divine transformation. The world does not welcome the chosen ones. Their presence is an affront, a reminder that truth is not subject to popular opinion. Their steadfastness is a challenge, exposing the frailty of human compromise. To belong to God is to be a stranger in one's own land, to walk a road where every step invites scorn. A voice called out in the dark, breaking his thoughts. "Why do you persist? Why speak when they do not listen?" He turned to face the speaker. It was a young man, his eyes sharp with curiosity, yet dimmed with hesitation. There was fear in his voice, fear of the answer and what it might demand. He smiled, not in derision, but in understanding. Because the truth remains, even when ignored, and God's calling does not fade with the world's rejection. The young man frowned. "But does it not weary you to be mocked, to be cast aside?" Of course, he admitted, even Christ wept, even he asked why he was forsaken. But seeking the approval of men is a snare. Their praise is fleeting, their acceptance fickle. To seek their favor is to be blown like chaff in the wind, but to trust in God, that is to stand upon the rock. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like a murmuring crowd. The young man looked away, lost in thought. Then what is victory, if not their approval? Victory is transformation. Those who doubted or ridiculed will soon witness God's undeniable power at work. What was once weakness will be replaced with unshakable strength. The change will be instantaneous and undeniable, shifting perception. Victory is to remain faithful, to trust when all else wavers, to endure even when abandoned. It is not measured in applause or the absence of trial, but in the unwavering grip upon God's truth. The young man exhaled a slow, weary breath, yet there was something new in his eyes, something kindled. "Then I will stand," he said at last, "even if they turn away, even if they laugh." A smile broke upon the older man's face, not of triumph, but of joy. "Then you have passed the test." And with that they turned towards the rising dawn, walking the road that so few dared to take. The weight of misplaced mercy. Jonathan had always believed in kindness. It was, after all, the very essence of Christ's love, to give without expecting in return. Yet, as he sat by his dimly lit window watching the cold rain streak down the glass, a quiet voice in his heart whispered, "You are weary, Jonathan, weary of giving where there is no gratitude." The thought troubled him. Was he not called to be generous? Had Christ himself not healed the ungrateful, fed the indifferent, and forgiven the wicked? Yet something gnawed at his soul, a restlessness, an exhaustion that no amount of prayer seemed to lift. Then, one evening, an old friend, Father Samuel, visited him. He was a man of quiet wisdom, his voice carrying the weight of years spent studying and praying. As they sat before the crackling fire, Jonathan confessed his unease. "I give, Father," he said, his voice heavy. "I give endlessly, but I feel drained, as though I am pouring water into broken cisterns." The old priest nodded knowingly. "Ah, my son, there is a difference between a wellspring and a leaky vessel. The Lord does not call us to sustain those who trample his gifts." Jonathan frowned. "But is that not unkind?" "Kindness," Father Samuel said, leaning forward, "is not indulgence. To give where there is no gratitude, to pour into hands that do not cherish, is not charity. It is folly." He gestured toward the Bible on the table. Proverbs tells us, "Do not rebuke mockers, or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise, and they will love you." Jesus himself warned, "Do not cast your pearls before swine." Jonathan sat back, troubled. "But what of mercy?" "Mercy," the priest said, "is given where it can take root." Christ did not beg the Pharisees to accept him. He did not chase those who turned away. When the rich young ruler left, Jesus did not call him back. God's gifts are not meant to be squandered on those who mock them. Jonathan pondered this, his mind tracing over the many times he had helped those who showed no gratitude, who only took, demanded, and returned with complaints. He had mistaken his own exhaustion for virtue, believing that the more depleted he felt, the holier he must be. But now a quiet realization settled over him. True charity does not drain, it edifies. God does not call his children to sacrifice their peace for those who despise it. Father Samuel continued, "Do you recall the story of the 10 lepers? Only one returned to give thanks. Yet Jesus did not go after the other 9. He blessed the one who recognized the gift." He placed a gentle hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "My son, God sees the unseen. He knows the efforts that have gone unthanked, but he also calls us to wisdom. If a man rejects the bread of life, do not hand him more bread. You are called to give, but to those who will receive, not simply take." Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in years. He had not failed in kindness, he had merely misunderstood it. He had mistaken wastefulness for generosity, endurance for righteousness. Now he saw the path more clearly, to help those who valued the gift, to give where it would bear fruit, and to leave the ungrateful to their own devices. That night, as he knelt in prayer, he no longer asked for strength to keep pouring into broken vessels. Instead, he asked for discernment, to give as Christ gave, to bless as Christ blessed, and to walk away when necessary as Christ himself had done. And for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The law of consequence, a spiritual reckoning. The night was thick with silence. The stars shimmered above like a council of watchful eyes, their cold glow casting a quiet judgment upon the earth. In the heart of a small village, a man stood alone. His deeds had been generous, his heart open, yet he found himself weary, drained of joy. He had given and given, yet peace eluded him. He had not sought reward, nor had he wished for recognition. Yet he had hoped that kindness would return as kindness, that love would bear love. Instead, he found himself entangled in the burdens of others, trapped in the darkness of their troubles. This, he realized, was the great test. It had been the same for those before him. Job, a man of unwavering faith, had suffered not for his sins but for a greater truth. Joseph had shown mercy to his brothers, yet still endured years of imprisonment and betrayal. Even Christ himself had given love, only to be met with scorn, rejection, and the cross. Why should it be any different now? The law of consequence is not swayed by human sentiment. Every action bears fruit, some sweet, some bitter. To give where it is undeserved is to plant seeds upon stone, to pour water into broken vessels. True charity is not blind generosity, but wisdom in knowing where to sow. A voice called out in the dark, breaking his thoughts. Why do you persist? Why give when you are repaid with suffering? He turned to face the speaker. It was a young man, his eyes sharp with curiosity, yet dimmed with hesitation. There was fear in his voice, fear of the answer, fear of what it might demand. He smiled, not in derision but in understanding. Because kindness, when misplaced, does not heal. It burdens. To help without discernment is to share in another's judgment. God's mercy is not without wisdom. The young man frowned. But are we not called to help all? We are called to be stewards of his love, not reckless givers of our spirit. Even Christ did not heal all he met, nor did he answer every plea. He knew that some in their hearts were not ready. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like a murmuring crowd. The young man looked away, lost in thought. Then how do we know where to give? He stepped forward, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. Seek the guidance of God. Give where it cultivates righteousness, where it lifts and restores. But do not entangle yourself in the burdens of those who refuse to change. The energy you pour into them will return not as blessings, but as sorrow. The young man exhaled, a slow, weary breath. Yet there was something new in his eyes, something kindled. Then I will give wisely, he said at last, with discernment, not mere impulse. A smile broke upon the older man's face, not of triumph, but of joy. Then you have passed the test. And with that they turned towards the rising dawn, walking the road that so few dared to take. The lantern bearer. Elijah sat by the well at the edge of the village, his hands clasped together, his spirit heavy. For years he had given much of his time, his counsel, his love, to those who came seeking wisdom. But tonight, as the stars glowed dimly above, he felt only emptiness. Had he poured out too much? Had he been wrong to give so freely? A faint rustle in the olive grove behind him signaled the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Turning, he saw an old man wrapped in a simple robe, leaning on a staff. His eyes, deep and knowing, studied Elijah with quiet understanding. "You are weary," the old man said. Elijah nodded. "I have given all I have, yet it is never enough. People take, and I am left with nothing." The old man lowered himself onto a nearby stone. "Tell me, have you ever seen a lantern that gives its light until it is no more?" Elijah frowned. "A lantern shines until its oil runs dry." "Exactly," the old man said, "and a wise keeper knows when to refill it. But you, my friend, have given your light without tending your oil. You have forgotten that even kindness must be guarded." Elijah lowered his gaze. "But is that not what God calls us to do? To give without question, to love without limit?" The old man smiled. "Ah, but love is not the same as surrender. Did our Lord not retreat to the wilderness to pray? Did he not seek renewal from the Father? He poured himself out, yes, but never without first being filled. A lantern without oil is useless in the dark. Elijah felt a deep stirring within him. He had always believed that giving was his duty, but he had neglected the truth that even servants of God must be replenished. "Then what must I do?" he asked. "Come." The old man rose and gestured toward the well. "Draw water for yourself first." Elijah hesitated. He had spent his life ensuring others were filled, yet the idea of tending to his own spirit felt unnatural. Still, he obeyed. As he pulled the bucket from the well and drank deeply, a warmth spread through him. It was as if he had been thirsty for years without realizing it. The old man watched with a knowing nod. "You see, when your cup is full, you can pour out freely, but an empty vessel gives nothing." Elijah closed his eyes. He understood now. He had mistaken exhaustion for righteousness, depletion for sacrifice. But true service, true love, meant ensuring the light never went out. When he opened his eyes, the old man was gone. Only the whispering wind remained, carrying a single truth to his heart. God created you as a beacon of light, not a vessel for others' mistakes. And so, for the first time in years, Elijah allowed himself to rest, knowing that in his renewal he would shine brighter than ever before. The cost of helping those who mock you. The night was restless. A man walked alone through the dimly lit streets, his heart burdened with the weight of ungrateful souls. He had given again and again, expecting nothing in return, yet receiving only scorn. His kindness had been mistaken for weakness, his generosity exploited. And now he felt empty. He thought of the scriptures. Even Christ had been mocked, his miracles met with doubt, his love repaid with betrayal. "Do not cast your pearls before swine," he had warned. Yet how often do we ignore this wisdom, believing we can soften hearts that refuse to listen? A beggar sat at the corner, one he had helped many times before. The man stopped, debating whether to give once more. But something within him hesitated. Was this true compassion? Or was he merely feeding an endless hunger that would never be satisfied? "Why do you hesitate?" the beggar sneered. "Have you lost your generosity?" The words stung, but the man stood firm. Generosity without wisdom is waste. Love must be guided by truth. "I have given, but have you ever sought to change? Or do you only take, believing my kindness is endless?" The beggar scoffed. "It is your duty to give. If you follow God, you must serve." "And yet even God commands rest," the man replied. "Even he does not give endlessly to those who mock him. He calls us to wisdom, to discern when our giving ceases to be love and becomes enablement." The beggar laughed, but there was unease in his eyes. "So you abandon me now?" "No," the man said gently, "but I will not be used. I will pray for you, but I will no longer pour from an empty cup." As he walked away, a strange peace settled over him. He had not closed his heart, he had simply learned to guard it. And in doing so, he had found a greater strength, one that would allow him to love truly without being drained into nothingness. For love, after all, is not just giving, it is also knowing when to stop. The withering soul. Jonah had always been kind. He saw it as his duty, his sacred calling, to help, to give, to sacrifice. Yet, as the years passed, a strange weariness settled upon him, a heaviness he could not shake. At first he dismissed it as mere exhaustion, but then came the silence within him, the numbing void where once joy had dwelled. It was not physical illness that plagued him. His body remained strong, his mind sharp. But his soul, that delicate vessel of light, had begun to dim. He felt no warmth in prayer, no solace in scripture. He helped, he gave, and yet he felt only emptiness in return. It was as if every act of kindness took something from him, leaving him hollow. One evening he sought counsel from an old friend, a scholar named Elias. "I do what is right," Jonah confessed, "but I feel as if I am slowly fading away." Elias studied him with piercing eyes. "Tell me, Jonah, do you give because it is right, or do you give because you cannot say no?" Jonah hesitated. "Does it matter? The Lord calls us to serve." "Yes," Elias said gently, "but he does not call us to surrender ourselves to destruction." Jonah frowned. Is not love about sacrifice? Indeed, but love, true love, is also wisdom. Elias leaned forward. Every time you pour yourself into those who misuse your kindness, you do not strengthen them, you only deplete yourself. There are those who drink from your well and never seek to be filled themselves. They demand, they take, and they leave you with nothing. Jonah looked away. He thought of the many he had helped. Those who returned only when they needed more, those who took his generosity as their right, those who drained him without gratitude. And yet, was it not his duty to love them still? Elias continued. Spiritual illness is not always caused by sin or rebellion. Sometimes it is caused by misplaced virtue. You are not meant to be devoured by your calling. Even Christ, in his perfect love, withdrew to the wilderness to pray. Even he knew that to give endlessly without renewal was to invite ruin. Jonah felt a chill settle over him. Had he been mistaken? Had he confused sacrifice with self-destruction? Elias stood and placed a hand on Jonah's shoulder. You must learn to discern. Love is not an open door to all who seek to exploit it. Love is also knowing when to step back. Healing begins when you recognize the cycle and break it. That night Jonah prayed, not with empty habit but with desperate longing, and for the first time in years he felt something stir within him. A whisper, a breath of renewal. He had spent so long giving that he had forgotten to receive. He had let the world empty him without returning to the source. And in that moment he understood, to pour out without first being filled is not love. It is slow, quiet ruin. He would still give, he would still love, but no longer at the cost of his own soul. Boundaries, the key to spiritual preservation. It was a lesson that took Samuel years to learn. He had always believed that love meant endless giving, that to turn away from someone in need was an act of selfishness. And so he gave his time, his strength, his very soul to those who called upon him. But in the end he found himself emptied, a vessel drained by those who never sought to be filled. One evening, as he sat beneath an ancient olive tree, burdened by the weight of betrayal, an old man approached him. "You look troubled, son," the elder said, settling onto the ground beside him. Samuel sighed. "I do not understand. I have given without question, helped without hesitation, yet I am left weary and broken." The old man nodded knowingly. "Tell me, do you believe that God sees all things, even the hidden burdens of the heart?" "Of course," Samuel replied. "Then why do you carry loads he never asked you to bear?" Samuel looked up, startled. The old man's eyes were kind yet piercing, as though he could see straight through to Samuel's soul. "But aren't we called to love unconditionally?" Samuel asked. The elder smiled. "Love, yes, but love without wisdom leads to ruin. Some people do not seek healing, they seek to take. They will drink from your well without ever digging their own. If you allow them, they will leave you empty and then curse you for your dryness." Samuel lowered his gaze. He had known people like that. Friends, family, even strangers who came to him in desperate need, but vanished when their thirst was quenched. He had thought their departure was a failure on his part, proof that he was not enough. "But if I do not help them, who will?" he whispered. "God," the old man said simply. "It is not your duty to be the savior of all. That role is already filled. Every time you step in to fix someone's mistakes, you pay a spiritual price, and often they learn nothing in return." Samuel frowned. "So I should abandon them?" "No," the elder said gently. "You are not abandoning them, you are protecting your spirit. There is a difference between mercy and enabling. Even Christ himself walked away when hearts were hardened. He did not chase those who refused to see. He did not let their rejection define his worth. And neither should you." A soft breeze rustled through the branches above, whispering a truth Samuel had long ignored. Boundaries were not walls of selfishness, they were gates of wisdom. God saw all, even what Samuel could not. And sometimes the most loving thing he could do was to step back and let God work. As the old man rose to leave, he placed a firm hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Trust that God sees what you do not. Love freely, but guard your spirit. Not all who come to you seek salvation. some only seek to take. Samuel watched as the elder walked away, his heart lighter than it had been in years. That night, under the watchful stars, he decided. He would love, give, but no longer carry what was never his to hold. Final warning: protect your energy. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the whispers of things unseen. Jonathan stood at the cliff's edge, looking down at the village below. He had spent years pouring his heart into others, lifting, mending, sacrificing, and yet it never seemed to be enough. The more he gave, the more they took. He had mistaken his kindness for duty and his duty for salvation. But now, standing on the precipice, he heard a voice, deep and steady, speaking not to his ears but to his soul. "You were never meant to bear their burdens," the voice said. "Your strength is meant for the path I have set before you." Jonathan turned swiftly, but there was no one there. Only the vast sky, painted with the last hues of sunset. He clenched his fists. "But if I do not help them, who will? They must face their own trials," the voice replied. "You are not their savior. They have their own choices, their own lessons to learn." A wave of understanding washed over him. He had been trying to shield others from consequences meant to shape them. Was it not the same with the prodigal son? The father did not chase after him when he squandered his inheritance. He let him go, let him fall, and only when the son returned, broken and humbled, did the father run to meet him. There was wisdom in allowing others to walk through the fire of their own making. Jonathan thought of Peter walking on water. He had stepped out in faith, and yet, when he doubted, he began to sink. Christ did not prevent the sinking. He allowed Peter to struggle until he called out for help. Only then did he reach out his hand. There was a lesson in the sinking. Jonathan had exhausted himself for so long, believing love meant preventing hardship. But true love, he realized, was standing firm and allowing others to find their way back to the Father. If he constantly intervened, how would they ever learn to call upon God themselves? The voice spoke again. "You cannot pour from an empty vessel. Protect your energy, for your purpose is great. If you spend yourself recklessly, you will be too weary to fulfill it." He sank to his knees. The weight on his shoulders lifted, as if the very heavens had peeled away the chains he had placed upon himself. It was not his role to save everyone. That was God's work. His task was to shine the light, be a beacon, and not drag others up the mountain when they refused to climb. As he stood, peace settled in his heart. He would no longer give his strength to those who wasted it. He would no longer throw his pearls before swine. Instead, he would walk the path set before him, undistracted, unwavering. Ultimately, it was not his job to carry the world, but to follow the one who already did. There is a moment when every soul must reckon with the truth, that not all who seek your light are meant to walk beside you. Perhaps you have felt it, the weariness that comes from pouring yourself into those who neither cherish nor understand the gift you offer. But take heart, for even Christ himself did not waste his miracles on those who scoffed. God's message is not one of abandonment, but of wisdom. To love is not merely to give, it is to discern. The world is filled with those who would drain the spirit of the willing, and it is not your burden to carry them. Instead, God calls you to guard the light within you, that it may shine upon those truly ready to receive it. So walk forward with courage, unburdened, let go of those who do not honor your kindness, and step into the purpose God has prepared for you.